So here's what I just asked ChatGPT to give me an argument for why we are just players in a video game. Imagine reality as a vast simulation, much like a highly advanced video game. If you consider that video games today can simulate entire worlds with AI-driven characters, virtual physics, and seemingly endless environments, it's not hard to imagine that a civilization far more advanced than ours could simulate an entire universe. Now, think about how many video games exist compared to the number of real worlds. In the future, a single civilization could create billions of these simulations, potentially even creating simulations of simulations. Statistically, then, the odds suggest that it's more likely we're inside one of these artificial worlds than living in the original base reality. If we are players, then things like physics, consciousness, and even free will could be part of the programming rules that guide this game. So, are we? Yeah. What do you think? Have you heard this objection? And what I'm more interested in isn't that we could be players in a video game, but why we're so willing to entertain the idea.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so let me try to address both of those. My initial response to that is that that whole line of argument presupposes essentially, either at least implicitly, if not explicitly, that it makes sense to think of the human mind as a kind of software that might be part of some machine right now that's running a larger video game program or virtual reality, and the human mind's a subroutine in that larger computational process. And I just don't think that's correct. I don't think it's, I would argue, this is also something I get into in the new book, that it's not just empirically false, but ultimately unintelligible to think of the mind as a kind of software, to think of the mind as a computer program and the brain as the hardware that the program is running on. That's a very common view these days. I would say the reason it's common is because it's the only remotely plausible, and I don't think it's plausible at all, but it's the only remotely plausible account that modern philosophy has been able to give of how the human intellect can be explained in material terms. And there's nothing even remotely close as a competitor. So the idea is it's the only game in town. So if that approach isn't correct, then we're not going to be able to give a materialistic explanation of the mind. And so the argument continues, we all know materialism is true. Well, that's a false premise as well. But since they think that materialism must be true, and this is the only way we could explain it, then this idea that the mind is a kind of software must be the correct approach to human intelligence. Now, I would say, well, the view that the mind is software is ultimately incoherent. It makes no sense. And if there's no alternative explanation that's compatible with materialism, I would say, well, I don't think materialism is true anyway. So that's not a telling objection at all. So there's a lot philosophically, in other words, that's going on here that's presupposed by that scenario. There's a lot of metaphysics underlying that little scenario that would have to be unpacked and evaluated. And I would say that it's a bad metaphysics, that account of the mind is ultimately unintelligible. I would say that to think that the mind is a kind of software is analogous to thinking that what Penn and Teller do is really magic. If somebody said, well, look, the effects that Penn and Teller and other magicians can produce these days are so amazing and so compelling, maybe magic is real, and maybe that's what magic really is.
You take the ball, you place in your hand, you vanish it, and it appears underneath the cup.
It's always been real, and it's really been what Penn and Teller do. No, they're simulating magic. They're not doing real magic. They don't claim to be.
It goes like this. Take the first ball, pretend to place it in our hand, have it already snuck underneath the first cup.
They're doing tricks that mimic the effects of magic, but it's not real magic. And I would say that what computers do is essentially a simulation. It's a kind of trick that mimics what we do when we carry out intellectual activities, but it's not the real McCoy. Now, spelling that out in detail is something I do in the book, and it's, I don't expect the most hard-nosed defender of AI and of the computer model of the mind to be convinced just by that much.
Is this your book, Immortal Souls? Or
Immortal Souls, yeah. Okay, but so one thing I'd say about that is that it rests on mistaken philosophical assumptions. So it fails that first test that a skeptical scenario needs to meet that I mentioned earlier, which was the skeptic needs to give me a description of how what he's describing is actually a possibility and not just verbiage. And I would say when you unpack that, the answer GPT gave you, it's not actually a coherent scenario. Then you raise the question, well, why are people so drawn to this? And I think it's because one of the pathologies of modern life, and by modern I mean the last few centuries, but it's accelerated in the last few decades, is this romanticization of the skeptic, of the daring individual who challenges, institutions and traditional ideas. It begins with people like Luther. It begins with people like Descartes, who you mentioned earlier, founding all knowledge on what he can know from his own individual point of view. And he's doubted the entire world away. All he knows is I think, therefore I exist. And if I'm going to know anything else, I'm going to have to spin it out of what I know about myself. Those are they're not the only ones, but they're among the origins of this modern cult of the daring individual skeptic. And so whether it's some scientific genius or just some punk on Reddit who's mouthing off, right? People tend to give a kind of deference to someone who raises skeptical questions. Well, at least he's thinking,
Interesting.
He's raising questions, and we ought to respect that. Well, some questions are just dumb questions, and sometimes they're not really motivated by intellectual curiosity. They're motivated by a desire to be a smart ass or to thumb your nose at what your parents think or at what society expects of you or at the religion you were raised in or what have you. And a lot of the deference people pay to these sorts of skepticism really drives from that. It's not because of their intellectual merits, but because it conforms to a cultural stereotype that is itself, I think, a pathological stereotype, or it appeals to a kind of emotional satisfaction at the thought of being an independent thinker, of someone who's standing up against the herd and all this kind of stuff.
I've never thought of that. I think it's a great point. I also think it sounds credible because it's science-y.
Right.
That's weird, isn't it? Like with it, I'd be okay going along with the argument, even to the point where I accept it, but I'm not in any way open to the idea of there being a creator who's immaterial of the universe.
Right.
Again, it has this kind of, whenever something's science-y, I have this impression that it somehow must be more credible.
Yeah. It's a selective kind of appeal to the individual skeptic and association of that attitude with science. So people have in mind models. They think of Galileo saying, under his breath, and yet it moves, even as he's publicly allowing that, the earth doesn't really move and so on. That he's the lone man of science, the lone individual skeptic who's willing to speak truth to power and all this kind of stuff. Okay. But as you say, if somebody comes along and says, you know what? I have this radical idea. Just hear me out, folks, right? I know this is radical. I know it upends centuries of thought. People, what is it? We can't wait to hear it. The Enlightenment was a mistake, right? The medievals were right. Nobody's going to think, interesting, let's hear you out. That's a radical, skeptical, that's like a meta-skepticism. Cool. No, they think, oh, come on, shut up, you're a crackpot.
We want new stuff, don't we?
We want new stuff, right. We don't want to we want to be skeptical of everything but that. We don't want that, right? Or if there's, as we know from the last 4 years, if someone is questioning established wisdom in the name of science, if they say, look, maybe lockdowns were a good idea, maybe not. Yeah. Maybe the vaccine is a good idea, but maybe it isn't, or maybe we shouldn't make it mandatory and so on. That people weren't thinking, the usual independent thinkers weren't saying, we think you're wrong, but let's hear you out, right? It was shut up, you're anti-science, you're killing grandma, all this kind of stuff. It was this shrill groupthink. And the point isn't, I'm not making a point now about the vaccine or lockdown. I know people are going to get all up in their, this is one of these issues people can't think calmly about. The point is just that whoever was right on that issue, the fact that even raising questions, even among people who were undeniably credentialed scientists, some of whom were just asking, let's just put the brakes on this a little bit, right? I'm not saying it's about it. Let's just think about it, and we're shouted down. It shows you how selective this cult of the independent thinker and the independent thinker who's raising questions in the name of science, how selective all that is.
Yeah, I love that. I'm going to say tactic that makes it sound manipulative. That's not what I mean. I love that tactic of saying, okay, well, help me understand this alternative that you're saying it could be so that I can decide whether it's even a possibility. And the reason I like that is because when somebody says, well, how do you know this and not this? They're kind of giving you the burden of proof. But I like that idea of putting it back on them and going, oh, okay, I'm willing to entertain this, but I need to know what it is first. Yeah. And then having them walk you through that. Hey, thank you so much for watching. Before you go, do us a favor, leave a comment, let us know what you thought of the video, like, and subscribe.